Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. Bill Tenny-Brittian and lecturer for this course, the leader of this course, and I'm glad you've decided to join me on this journey. Over the next several weeks, we are going to look at the probably second most influential person in all of the New Testament, perhaps even in all of the Bible. Jesus being first, but Paul is at least second. And writer extraordinaire, normally called Saint Paul. We're going to learn a lot about him over the next few weeks, and I hope that you will buckle in. You'll take notes because there will be a quiz, and it's a self-guided quiz, if you will. It's an open book. You can go back and rewatch the video if you want to, but my recommendation is take good notes, because that way you won't have to rewatch the video over and over and over again. Again, thanks for joining me, and I hope you have as much fun taking this course as I'm having leading it. So let's get started. Today we're talking about Paul the man. We're giving you essentially an overview of who Paul was. You probably know a lot of this, but hopefully you'll find a few surprises. So Paul. Who was Paul? Well, let's be honest and up front. His name wasn't Paul to begin with, except for his name was always Paul. And we'll go into that in just a bit. The reality is we don't know very much about Paul before his conversion. We know a little bit just pre-conversion, but we don't know a whole lot specifically. It's not like there's a biography out there that we can go and grab and say, oh, well, here's an autobiography about Paul, or even very many biographies about him. Mostly the information we have and what I'm going to be sharing today comes from the book of Acts, and then his own letters, the letters that he wrote to various churches, and we'll be talking more about that. And from those books, we can gather a good bit of information about who Paul was. We expect that he was born somewhere between 5 BC and AD 5, which, perhaps not coincidentally, is about the same period in which we think Jesus was born. So he was a contemporary of Jesus, probably pretty close to the same age. But Paul never met Jesus in person, in real life. Of course, he has the vision and his conversion. We'll talk about that in a bit. But he never really met Jesus face to face. For one, is he wasn't living anywhere near where Jesus was residing during his ministry. Paul was from a place named Tarsus. He was born in Tarsus. He is called Saul of Tarsus repeatedly, and Saul being the Hebrew version of Paul. And that he was born in Tarsus gives us an indication that his family was somehow Jewish folks who had left Jerusalem for whatever reason and had settled in Tarsus. Probably his dad was a businessman. Pretty good chance that he was in the leather trade or perhaps in the tent making trade, something along those lines, because Paul eventually gets trained in that, or we hear that Paul is trained in that. Tarsus is the capital of Roman Cilicia, which we hear about a couple times in the New Testament, Paul hanging out there, probably hanging out at home. Tarsus is on the Cydnus River. It's a river port. It dumps into the Mediterranean, and it was a huge trade center. In fact, during Alexander the Great's years, it was considered to be one of the most influential cities in all of Alexander the Great's region, if you will, his empire. But in any event, it's quite a city, and Paul was probably raised and immersed in business and business sense, but he was a Hebrew. He was Jewish. And of course, Saul is as I said, is a Hebrew name. Saul, we're told, is from the tribe of Benjamin. And interesting enough, Saul, the King Saul, the very first king of Israel, was also from the tribe of Benjamin. So there's a pretty good chance that Paul, was named after King Saul. We don't know much about his family. we presume he had a mom and a dad. As far as other family, we know he had a sister. We know that he had a nephew, and he was probably, or at least possibly, related to a guy named Andronicus and a woman named Junia, who were both considered apostles by Paul, and he greets them as his kinsmen. Now, some versions say, are my fellow Jews, but it's really tighter than just they're other Jewish people. They're his kinsmen, which is interesting because it also suggests in one of those lists that Paul was related perhaps to the Herod family, perhaps Herod the Great. In Acts 16:11, we see that possibility. So, interesting concept there, or thought that he was perhaps almost royalty, which really isn't too far of a stretch because he was born a Roman citizen by birth, which is a big deal. So somewhere his dad or his grandfather, likely his dad, became a Roman citizen, was granted or conferred that status, and Paul was born into that status. He calls himself a Pharisee of Pharisees. And so there's some possibilities that Paul was raised by, maybe his father was a Pharisee, perhaps a Pharisee by, his part-time profession, if you will, perhaps not making his full-time living as a rabbi or as a member of the Pharisees. Not every Pharisee made their living as Pharisees. They were scholars, well-learned, and perhaps Paul was raised this. But in any event, we know that he was raised in a devout Jewish family. There are some, or seems to be some, family connections. Likely, again, he was raised as a child in his father's business, perhaps in the Pharisee part of it, but also in the tent making part of it, or the leather making. He's called an artisan, so he was skilled in these things. The name Paul, just to clear that up, is really a Latin transliteration, basically a transliteration of the Hebrew word Saul, with, of course, a slight twist there on the first letter, and he would have been called Paulus. That would have been his given name. He spoke Hebrew. Obviously, he spoke Hebrew because he was a Pharisee and raised of Jewish parents, probably. But the language that he seemed most comfortable with was Koine Greek, which was a common language that day, and it's the language in which most of the New Testament is written in. And Koine Greek is not some highfalutin Greek. One of the things that we often think is that that the Bible is so very formal, and then the New Testament was written in this formal Greek. Well, Homerian Greek and Greek from Plato and all those folks, that Greek was very highfalutin, if you will. Koine Greek was the language of the guy out in the street. It's not so much gutter. It's not like filled with lots of slang and whatnot, but it's just the language of people. It's the language that people spoke. And that's the language that Paul seems to be most comfortable with. Certainly, that's the language he seemed to have written all of his letters in. We know more about Paul just before his conversion than we know about his childhood. Again, we know that he was raised in Tarsus, or at least born in Tarsus because of his name and what I've just shared. But the bottom line is we don't know a lot for sure. But then comes Acts chapter 6 and 7 and 8. And in chapter 6, we have the deacons, the first deacons, if you will, the people who waited tables. They were in charge of the food pantry, so to speak. And one of those guys was a guy named Stephen. And Stephen does more than food pantry work. He's also apparently a preacher. He and Philip, both of the 7 original deacons. And Stephen goes out on a preaching tour, so to speak, and he gets himself in trouble because he lays into the pious Jews and just he goes at them pretty hard, and they end up killing him. He was the first martyr, if you will, of the Christian movement. And we find his death at the end of Acts chapter 7. And he inflames this group, he's pulled out, and they stone him. And it says that Saul approved of his stoning. Now, so Saul was there. He was down in the Palestine area, the Jerusalem area, for whatever reason. Perhaps he relocated there. Perhaps he was studying there. Perhaps he had become a bigwig in with the Pharisees. Because, well, in chapter 8, verse 1, where it says that Paul approved of it, it seems, or Saul approved of it, it seems to suggest that perhaps Saul was either behind this and that he was like, yes, or else this killing, this martyrdom of this Jewish guy who had gone off with a sect of Christians and had really polluted the Jewish faith as far as several were concerned. Paul either is inflamed by the killing and is like, yeah, that's what we need to do, or else he was perhaps even behind it. In any event, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, it says that in the beginning of a great persecution came upon the church. And Saul, begins to work, if you will, it almost seems like a bounty hunter. He starts trying to round up these Jewish Christians, but it really, you got to be careful here, because it appears that he wasn't persecuting the Hebrew Christians. He was pursuing the Greek-speaking Christians because they were more outsiders. Now, we don't know that 100% for sure. We make some inferences because the apostles don't leave Jerusalem, and it says that all the rest of the Christians left Jerusalem, which may imply really more that those who were Hellenistic or Greek-speaking Jews who had become Christians fled, and they went all over the place. And the Acts talks about that. Some went to Syria, some went to Cyprus, and so on. Some end up in Antioch, which comes up here in just a little bit. So Saul goes and begins work as a bounty hunter. He begins hunting down Christians, it says, going from house to house and dragging them out in chains, arresting them. We don't know what happened to them. We have really no evidence that they're being put to death at this point, not by the Jewish people, because the Jewish people didn't have permission to do that. The Jewish nation, the Israelites, couldn't do that without permission of the Romans, and the Romans aren't likely allowing crucifixions or stonings. They got away with Stephen perhaps, but it wasn't a wholesale thing what was really going on. But they're being imprisoned because they're heretics. They've defamed the Jewish faith with this whole Christianity. So Saul, again, goes to the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, and they give him essentially arrest warrants to go up to Damascus, leave Jerusalem, because everyone's left Jerusalem. All these Greek-speaking Jewish Christians have left, and so he goes to pursue them, and he's sent to Damascus, or he chooses to go to Damascus. Maybe he's heard that there's an enclave of them up there. So he heads up to Damascus, and in Acts chapter 9, you'll read about Saul's conversion. The story is, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but real quick, he's on his way. By the way, there's nothing in the scripture says he was riding a horse. There's a very famous painting that shows the conversion of Saul and that he's riding a horse, but it's a painting. There's nothing scriptural about whether he was on a horse or not. He probably was. He was a Roman citizen, but we have no actual evidence of that. But he's on his way to Damascus, and suddenly there's this blinding light. Oh, by the way, he has several people going with him to go and make these arrests and whatnot. But there's this blinding light, and he's thrown to the ground, blinded by this light. And Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul goes, huh? Who are you? And Jesus introduces himself, and they essentially have a brief conversation. And Saul is struck blind and told to go into town, in Damascus, where he would meet a guy and he would be taken care of, and that he just to wait there for a little bit. So Saul is sent to Ananias' house to shelter for a little bit. Ananias is a Jewish Christian, and God, the Spirit, speaks to Ananias and says, listen, I'm sending Saul to you, and I want you to take care of him and pray for him and essentially, convert him. And Ananias goes, are you kidding me? Have you not read the headline news that this guy is trouble? He's out to arrest us and take us back in chains to Jerusalem to stand trial. And the Spirit goes, Jesus goes, don't worry about it. I got this covered. I've got work for him to do. You just be faithful, and I'll take care of Saul. And so Saul's brought there, if you will, and for 3 days, apparently he fasts and prays, and God has a few words with him. Jesus has some words with him, and we have no idea what those are. But after 3 days, Ananias lays hands on him. He prays for him. Something, scales, cataracts, whatever, something falls out of his eyes so he can see again. And Saul is then baptized and becomes a Christian. And the reality is, from that point on, we never hear about Saul again. It becomes Paul. There's a change here because up until this point, Saul has been persecuting and working with and representing the Israelites, or the Jewish people. So he's Saul. But from this point on, we see a change, and Saul becomes Paul. And from this point on, it's only Paul, because Paul becomes, if you will, a missionary to the Gentiles. That hasn't happened yet, but it's about ready to. So he stays in Damascus for some time. We don't know whether it's a matter of weeks, a matter of days, months, whatever, but some time passes and he begins to preach. And people are like, wait a minute, isn't this guy who was trying to kill everybody, or at least arrest them? And so a plot gets hatched to put Paul out of their misery. And Paul gets wind of this, and he escapes through the basket out of the walls of Damascus, and he escapes to Arabia. We find that in Galatians. It talks about his Arabian tour. He goes to Arabia for 3 years. Now, if you're reading in Acts, when you get to Acts 9:25, he's in Damascus, and in Acts 26, he's taken to, or goes to, Jerusalem. And it seems like there's no space in between there, but it's clear, or it appears to be clear, that when he left Damascus after he escaped, that he went to Arabia, maybe to the Mount Sinai, which is interesting because Sinai really isn't in Arabia as we understand it, but Paul says that it was in Arabia, so he obviously either has the geography messed up, or else he just extends that whole area. Hey, this whole wilderness area, it's all got to be Arabia because it's not ours, and whatever. So he went there, but he seems to have stayed there for 3 years, where Paul says he was trained, or he learned all he needed to learn about Christianity from Jesus himself. That Jesus appeared there and in some way taught him everything he needed to know, his theology, his background, the words and the sayings of Jesus, and what he was all about. After that 3 years, apparently he goes back to Damascus, and he hangs out there for another 3 years. Somewhere after that time, he decides that he needs to go to Jerusalem. He needs to make a connection with the apostles. And so he goes there to Jerusalem, and nobody wants to see him. Now, we're back in Acts 9:26, that all this gap has taken place, and he goes there, and nobody wants to see him because he still has this reputation that he may have fallen off the grid, but the last they heard, he was hunting Christians down, so no one wants to see him. But Barnabas, who for whatever reason seems to have this affinity and connection with him, he finds or hears about Paul. He goes and has a conversation with him. Says, come on with me, I'll introduce you. And so he goes and introduces him to James, and apparently James and Barnabas go to Peter, and they have a conversation, and nothing at this point. They get introduced. And so then Saul essentially goes home. We're told he goes back to Syria or Cilicia, which, remember, Tarsus is the capital of Cilicia. So he's probably hanging out there at this point and just, chilling out, perhaps still preaching, sharing the gospel, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the Christians who have been dispersed from Jerusalem back in 8:1, people in Antioch, some Gentiles, become Christian. And that's kind of troublesome to the Jewish folks, because they always felt like Christianity was a Jewish thing, and there were those who thought you ought to become or be Jewish and then become Christian. If you weren't a Jew, if you were a Gentile, a non-Jewish person, that you ought to become Jewish and become a Jewish Christian, essentially a Messianic Christian, if you will. And so this movement in Antioch concerns them, and so they send Barnabas up there to investigate. And Barnabas gets there, and he's apparently pleased by what he's seen, and these Gentiles are becoming Christians, and Barnabas says, man, I need to get someone. So he goes and finds Paul, and he brings Paul to Antioch, and they stay there for some time. We have no idea how long they stay there, but they stay there, and Paul begins with Barnabas to teach them. And from this point on, it's never Barnabas and Paul. From this point on, it's always Paul and Barnabas. Well, while Paul and Barnabas are in Antioch and doing their preaching thing, Antioch, for one, begins sending missionaries out, sending them hither and yon. And during this time, there is a huge famine comes across the Israel, which is south of Tarsus and all that. And the church, which has hung out in Jerusalem, at least the denominational headquarters, the apostles are hanging out there. They're so impoverished that they can't take care of themselves. So Paul in the Antioch church raises money, and Paul takes it, and with Barnabas, takes the money down to Jerusalem church. In Galatians 2:9, we read that they get there, they give the gift, and suddenly he receives the right hand of fellowship. Suddenly, if you will, Paul has been accepted into the Christian faith, if you will. He's now a trusted person after many years, but it's interesting that it was the money that talked. He brought money, they go, okay, he's for real, we can trust this guy. And from that point on, he launches into his missionary journeys. Paul takes 3 missionary journeys, and you can read all about them in Acts, and we'll cover some of that in the lectures. But during that time, it seems like there's this pattern. Paul and his team will go into a town, and they go first. If there's a synagogue there, they go to the synagogue. If there's not a synagogue there, they go to a place where there is expected to be a place of prayer, often by the river somewhere. So they go to the synagogue and go to this place of prayer. They begin to preach to the Jewish Christians, the Hebrew Christians. They're almost universally always rejected, although they always have some success. Paul dusts taps the dust off his feet and goes to the Gentiles. And they start a church there in this town after town, Corinth and Galatia and Ephesus and other places that they start these churches. And Paul gets them started, and then he leaves. Often because the Jewish people in town rise up against him, but it wasn't always the Jewish people. Others rise up against him and chase him out of town, sometimes stoning him, sometimes trying to put him to death, etc., beating him, etc. So he leaves the town, and in many cases he went back sometime later. He and Barnabas, or he and his other companions, Timothy, Titus, Silas, they would go back and they would appoint elders, or if you will, the preachers. They had the leaders in these churches. During these missionary journeys and post-missionary journeys, Paul wrote letters to these churches. He wrote 13 or 14 letters to the churches. Those are considered to be the ones we have in the Bible. There's 13 or 14 scholars argue over which ones are actually Paul and which ones aren't. We know that there's a letter that we've never seen, a letter to Laodicea. He writes two letters to Thessalonica and says, listen, read the letter from Laodicea. And Laodicean, you read the Thessalonians. Trade letters, we've no idea what happened to that letter. We presume it would have been different than the Thessalonican letter, but in any event, we see this beginning of looking at these letters as being more universal than just only for those towns, although there's certainly things like in the letter to the church at Corinth that were specific about that church because they were having trouble. just one other note about his letters is that Paul never wrote a letter to a church that was doing fabulously well. The nicest one he writes is to Ephesus. He doesn't bash them too hard, but almost every church, including the church in Ephesus, there was something going on, and Paul is writing to say, hey, you got a problem. We got to fix this. It's not okay. You're doing this, you're doing that, and you need to whatever. And so Paul writes his letters, and that's where we end up with his theology, which we're going to talk about that in another lecture, the various theological underpinnings and the what he teaches as a leader. Anyway, of the 14 letters that he wrote, scholars are attributed to him. He says he wrote them. 7 are absolutely undisputed by scholars. He wrote those. And 7 are, well, maybe he wrote them. On my point, my particular opinion is, the Bible says that he wrote them, and that's enough for me. And if he didn't, well, we can't prove it one way or the other. So why bother? I'll just go that Paul wrote them. It's not that important. All right. So one of the things that I want to point out about his journeys, his trips, he always, after he took his journey, after he did his missionary thing, after he started churches, and again, he made 3 major journeys, he always went back to Jerusalem or to Antioch, or sometimes both, to make a report. He was held accountable, or he held himself accountable to the church and said, hey, here's what we've done. What do you think? In fact, at least one time he goes to Jerusalem church and says, I wanted to make sure that they were on board with what I was doing and what I was teaching. And whenever there was a dispute between Paul or Paul and the Jewish Christians, he would appeal to the Jerusalem church to be the arbiter, to say, this is what we think. That didn't stop Paul, who was a bit of an opinionated kind of guy. He got in Peter's face at least one time in writing, and we read about it in writing. He was in person, where he accuses Peter of being a hypocrite. And hypocrisy was a big deal. That the church didn't tolerate hypocrisy very much, in fact, at all. If you want to read about how little they accepted hypocrisy, go to chapter 5 of the book of Acts and see what happens to Annas and Sapphira, who were hypocrites. They were trying to make themselves look good, and wow, they end up dead. But Paul says that Peter is being hypocrite because when he's with the Gentile people, the Gentile Christians, he's fine with eating whatever is there. But he goes, oh, no, you don't eat that way when he's with the Jewish Christians. And he goes, come on, Peter, get over it. And anyway, so it's not like Paul was always, the beloved child of the church, but certainly the most influential with all the work that he did. And again, he always went back to the denominational headquarters to report. In about AD 57, though, he makes his 4th or 5th trip, his final trip to Jerusalem. And while he's there, he hangs out, he's preaching, he's creating a stir, if you will, and some of the Jewish people, not Jewish Christians, Jewish people accuse him of bringing a Gentile into the temple, and that's forbidden. You can't bring a Gentile farther into the temple, into the court of the men, if you will. You can bring a Gentile into the court of Gentiles because there's a place for them, and then at least ostensibly you can't bring anyone a Gentile into the court of women, and certainly not in the court of men, and that's getting pretty far in there. And he's accused of that, and there's a riot. And the Jewish people are incensed, and they're about ready to beat Paul to death, so to speak. And a Roman centurion, the Roman guard, hear about the riot. And they send in the troops, and they rescue Paul and put him in chains. They arrest him because they presume that he's creating the riot. And they go to beat on him a little bit to try and find out what's going on. And he claims, Paul says, hey, you can't do this. I'm a Roman citizen. And he appeals to the emperor for his case. Now, as a Roman citizen, this is a big deal. Every Roman citizen had the right to appeal their case to the emperor, who would at least supposedly hear the case and render a final judgment. So he's arrested and he appeals to the emperor, and about 2-3 years later, he finally gets to Rome. It's a long journey. He's imprisoned for a while, and he appears before this tribunal and that tribunal. He appeared before King Agrippa, and he finally, in about AD 60, he makes it to Rome. And that's about where the book of Acts ends. That he's in Rome. We're told he has access to the emperor's household, which lends some credence to the notion that Paul, was related to King Herod, perhaps King Herod the Great, since he could access those high officials. Acts ends right there, and there's a lot of speculation what happens next. Paul had always wanted to go to Spain. He said he'd done everything he could in that part of the world. He wants to go to Spain to take the gospel, and there is some literary evidence written by the church later that suggests that he did indeed get to Spain, where he probably started churches and did what he always did, but he ends up, for whatever reason, somehow he ends up back in Rome, and somewhere around 64 to 68, Nero kills him. Now, we don't know how for sure. The tradition is that his head was lopped off. That's the most likely scenario, if you will, but that ends Paul's life, that Nero takes him out, along with, of course, Nero also killed Peter and several of the other apostles. Paul and his life and his legacy of his letters and the churches he started and the path that he cleared for non-Jewish people to become Christians, we can't say how important that is. I mean, it changed everything. Without the Apostle Paul, we're going to talk about what an apostle is and how Paul ends up being an apostle. But his apostolic work, his church planting, his inroads that he made, it can't be overstated, the influence that he had. His theology is with us today. His, of course, letters, 1/3 of the New Testament is attributed to Paul. His legacy lives on today. I hope that you have a little bit of a snapshot of Paul at this point. You know some more things perhaps you didn't know. And I want to invite you now to head over to the discussion questions. There's some questions there for you to answer. Don't forget that I want 2 things out of that. A, please cut and paste the question into your answer. When you create a new answer, start a new thread with an answer, please paste the question there so that I can know exactly what you're answering. And second, don't forget that you're expected to respond or to comment or question your fellow students, to interact with each other. There's some peer learning going on. Ask questions, share your thoughts, and keep it nice. No flames. If you disagree, say I disagree, but be nice about it. Respect is everything. Paul did confront Peter, but there was always a great deal of respect, both from Peter to Paul and from Paul to Peter. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week, and I'll see you on the forums in just a few minutes.